This video was brought to you by Brilliant. In the past few years, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has apparently developed a bit of a dangerous spending habit. Since the pandemic, Hungary has run annual budget deficits representing about 7% of GDP, well above the EU's 3% target and reliably one of the highest in the bloc. On top of that, the government looks unlikely to get it down anytime soon, having already surpassed their 4.5% target last month. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Hungary's ballooning budget deficit, and why, even if a full-blown crisis is unlikely, it still puts Orbán in a difficult spot. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with the basics. Obviously, a budget deficit just means that a state's spending exceeds collected tax revenues. And while most developed countries run mild deficits these days, larger deficits are usually the consequence of both weak revenues and heavy spending. The US, for instance, is due to run a deficit representing about 7% of GDP in the future. This is a consequence of both the fact that American tax revenues as a percentage of GDP are relatively low, about a third less than the EU, and that America is spending an absurd amount of money on things like environmental subsidies via the Inflation Reduction Act and its military budget, which is about 3.5% of GDP. What makes Hungary's case interesting, though, is that it's currently running at a similar deficit, coming in at 6.7% in 2023, but its tax revenues are pretty strong. Hungary has a bit of a reputation as a low-tax country, largely because it used to have the lowest corporation tax in the EU at just 9%, and was the loudest opponent of the OECD's proposed 15% minimum corporation tax. But corporation tax only accounts for a small fraction of overall revenues, and because Hungary actually has relatively high taxes on labour, its overall tax intake is pretty good. According to the OECD, Hungary's so-called tax wedge, basically the average income tax, stood at 41% in 2023, the 12th highest in the OECD and well above the average of 35%. This is perhaps the main reason that Hungary's overall tax revenues are pretty high by international standards. According to data from 2020, Hungary's tax revenues came in at about 38% of GDP, on par with Iceland, Norway and Germany, and the 16th highest in the world. Hungary's tax revenues have also risen steadily, at least in nominal terms, increasing by about 25% since the pandemic. Despite strong and rising revenues, though, Hungary's public sector deficit has grown steadily since 2015, and especially since the pandemic. In the past 4 years, it's averaged at nearly 7% of GDP, and this year the government had to raise its deficit target from 2.9% to 4.5% of GDP. But by June, they'd already gone past it. Hungary's budget deficit is obviously also well above the EU's 3% target, and Hungary's questionable fiscal practices have landed it in hot water with the EU multiple times in the past. And in fact, Hungary was one of the 8 countries reprimanded by the EU last month for breaking the union's spending rules. In theory, if Hungary doesn't fix its budget, it could be hit with a fine amounting to 0.1% of GDP every year, although this has never actually happened before. Anyway, you get the idea. A budget deficit is defined as the difference between spending and revenue, and Hungary has both a big deficit and strong revenues, which means that Orbán must be doing an awful lot of spending. So where is all this money going? Well, Orbán's spending spree really began after the pandemic, when, like many other countries, Hungary spent a lot of money keeping its economy ticking over, and Hungary's deficit duly spiked to 6% of GDP in 2020. Orbán then continued to spend big into 2021, both because of the pandemic, but also because opinion polls in late 2021 showed the Hungarian leader neck and neck with a united opposition for the first time ever. In order to win the electorate over, Orbán went on a multi-billion foreign spending spree of pre-election giveaways. Orbán handed out extra payments for pensioners, scrapped income tax for younger people, and offered grants to families to renovate their homes. Measures worth about 1% of GDP combined, or about $2 billion. His government also extended a generous family benefit regime that now costs nearly 5% of GDP per year, and represents Orbán's most popular policy among undecided voters, according to a 2020 survey. In fact, according to Reuters, only a quarter of the 12 billion euros from the EU's COVID recovery fund was actually spent on pandemic-related issues in the country. The rest of the money was spent on other items, including support for ethnic Hungarian diaspora living in Hungary's neighbouring countries, who had backed Orbán in previous elections. Hungary's economy was then badly hurt by Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent inflationary crisis. While Hungarian energy prices were relatively stable because Hungary continued to buy Russian oil and gas, the wider uptick in commodity prices and Orbán's spending habits meant that Hungary's inflation spiked in 2023, peaking at 25%, the highest in the EU. Orbán then spent a lot of money to protect Hungarian households from the worst of this inflation, especially pensioners. At the same time, Orbán had been spending big on flashy infrastructure projects, including a new stadium for the World Athletics Championships and an 80% stake in Budapest Airport, and what's commonly known these days as industrial policy. Here, Orbán has been particularly focused on batteries. By providing generous and costly incentives to South Korean and Chinese manufacturers, Hungary has become the fourth largest battery producer in the world. One of the other big problems for Hungary at the moment is the cost of servicing its debt, i.e. the cost of paying off the interest on the pre-existing debt. In part because Hungary has issued lots of inflation-linked bonds, which become significantly more expensive to service when inflation is high. In 2023, Hungary had the highest debt servicing costs in the EU, representing 4.3% of GDP. This has all put Orbán into a difficult spot for two reasons. Firstly, it's increased the EU's leverage over Hungary, because Orbán now needs the 30 billion euros worth of funds that the EU is currently withholding over a rule of law violation more than ever. But second, Hungary's fiscal woes have come at the same time as a new opposition movement, led by Peter Magyar, is gaining in the polls. This means that Orbán doesn't have the political space to cut spending or raise taxes, so instead, he's tried a whole load of unorthodox policies to ease his fiscal woes. This has included an extra 13% levy on bank deposit interest to encourage Hungarian households to buy government bonds, special taxes on Hungarian industry, and even pushing state-owned companies to raise some cash on behalf of the government. But these measures are unorthodox for a reason. They might work in the short term, but they're not permanent fixes, and they'll probably make Hungary's debt crisis more, not less difficult to resolve in the future. It's interesting that even as people ostensibly into politics, the TLDR team spends more and more time analysing data and economic information as it becomes increasingly critical. But as a bunch of people who are ordinarily more focused on words than numbers, we've really benefited from courses on brilliant.org in order to keep ourselves sharp. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. From foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. Even if you, like us, don't necessarily think of yourself as a traditionally STEM kind of person, these courses could prove incredibly useful for your life and career. In fact, Brilliant recently launched a ton of new content in data, all of which uses real-world data to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions. When it comes to our work, courses like these can help us to parse and visualize massive datasets and make them easier for both us and you to interpret. Plus, these new courses include real-life datasets from sources like Starbucks, X, and Spotify in order to bring the learning to life. To try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/TLDR or click the link in the description. Plus, by doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you for watching, and thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.